There's a silence in parts of Asia that doesn't feel empty. It feels watched. From the wind-swept plateaus of Tibet to the whispering rice fields of Vietnam. From dark jungles near forgotten villages to bone-strewn shrines in Mongolia. There are stories passed down in shadows, in offerings, in warnings never fully explained. Folklore is not just myth, it's memory with teeth. And across Asia, these memories are older than empires. They don't just frighten, they remind us that death is not always the end, that grief can linger, that a name once spoken can become a door. What makes Asian folklore so chilling isn't just the ghosts, it's what the ghosts want. Some want to be remembered, some want to be released, and some just want you. You're about to hear 10 first-hand encounters, each drawn from a different country, each rooted in real beliefs, real traditions, that still echo in the minds of those who live near the old places. These are not ghost stories, these are reminders. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to ChaTV, like this video, and turn on notifications, so you never miss the stories we're not supposed to tell. But most of all, stay quiet, and don't answer the whispers, because the folklore of Asia is still listening. I was 15 when my parents sent me to live with my aunt for the summer. They said it was to give me a break from the city, but I think they just needed space, maybe from each other, maybe from me. I'd been acting out a little, skipping classes, staying out too late. Whatever their reason, they packed me onto a bus and sent me north, to a small village outside Lao Cai, where my aunt lived alone in a stilt house overlooking the rice fields. I hadn't been to the countryside since I was a little kid, and everything felt distant, like I'd stepped into a slower world. The roads were cracked and dusty, the air thick with the smell of earth and burning wood, and the only sounds were birds, the occasional bark of a dog, and the low hum of insects. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. You don't realize how much constant noise surrounds you in the city until it's gone. My aunt was kind but quiet. She spoke softly, moved gently, like even her footsteps didn't want to disturb the ground. She lived in a small wooden house raised on stilts, with a thatched roof and a porch that faced miles and miles of rice paddies. She cooked over a wood fire, washed clothes by hand, and never once asked about my life back home. It was like she already knew I didn't want to talk about it. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd fall asleep to the sound of frogs croaking and wake up to roosters screaming like they owned the world. But something changed on the third night. I remember it clearly because that was the first time I felt like something was watching me. I'd gone to bed early, around 9, but I couldn't sleep. The air felt too still. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring up at the wooden beams above me, listening to the silence press in. There was no wind, no rustling, not even the frogs. And then I heard it, a soft, distant crying. At first, I thought maybe it was a baby or a woman mourning something. It was faint, just barely audible, but steady. It came from the direction of the fields, somewhere past the edge of the house. I sat up and held my breath. The crying didn't stop. If anything, it became more distinct the longer I listened. It wasn't a wail, it was too calm, controlled. A quiet sobbing, as if someone was sitting alone in the dark, trying not to be heard, but still needing to let it out. And then I heard my name, not shouted, not screamed, just spoken, whispered almost like an exhale. I froze. My skin went cold, my arms covered in goosebumps. I looked over at my aunt, who was fast asleep in the next room, her silhouette barely visible in the dim glow of the moonlight coming through the slats. I don't know why I got up. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fear of not knowing, but I stood slowly, crept across the creaking floor, and looked out through a narrow gap in the wooden wall. At first, I didn't see anything. The fields were bathed in silver light, still as glass. The water shimmered around the rice stalks, and then I saw her, a woman standing knee-deep in the water, her back to me. She wore a white ao dai, the kind my grandmother used to wear when she visited temples. It clung to her body like it was soaked. Her black hair hung long and limp, almost reaching her waist. She didn't move. She just stood there, looking out at the field, like she was waiting for something to return. I watched for what felt like minutes. She never turned, never took a step. I was about to back away when something changed. I couldn't explain it, but suddenly I felt like she knew I was there, like she could feel my eyes on her. And then, slowly, she tilted her head to the side, just slightly, just enough to make it look wrong. Unnatural. That's when I saw her legs. They weren't in the water. They were just above it. She wasn't standing in the field. She was floating, perfectly still, with the tips of her toes barely skimming the surface. Not a single ripple moved around her. And then she moved, not walking, gliding, effortlessly, without sound, without disturbing a single rice stalk. She drifted deeper into the field, away from the house, until the mist began to rise around her, and I could barely make her out anymore. Just as I began to step back from the window, she turned her head. Just her head. It twisted all the way around, too far, too slow. Her body remained facing the other direction, but her face looked straight at me, and she smiled. Her mouth was too wide, her eyes completely black, and her skin so pale it reflected the moonlight. I stumbled back and fell, hitting the floor with a dull thud. I must have made a noise because my aunt came in a few seconds later, holding a small oil lamp. She saw the look on my face and didn't say a word. She just helped me up and brought me back to my bed. She didn't ask what I saw, didn't comfort me. She just whispered, "Don't open the window again after midnight." The next morning, I begged her to tell me what was out there. She avoided the question at first, just kept sweeping the floor like I hadn't said anything. But later, while we were picking herbs from the garden, she finally spoke. "Some women die with grief still in them," she said, not looking at me. "If their pain was deep enough, the rice doesn't accept them. They're meant to return to the earth, but sometimes they don't. They stay behind, not living, not dead." I asked if it was a ghost. "No," she said. "A ghost is someone who remembers. This is something else, something that only remembers sadness." That was the last time I looked out the window at night. I stayed for 4 more weeks. I never heard the crying again, but the silence was louder after that. And every time I passed the fields, I looked down into the water, just to make sure it was empty. I don't talk about it much. People either laugh or look uncomfortable. But sometimes late at night when I hear wind moving through the trees, I swear I hear something in it. A whisper, not calling my name anymore, just reminding me, she's still there. I served my mandatory military term in Gangwon-do, near the DMZ, isolated mountainous terrain, snow that never fully melted. Our base was nicknamed Watchpost Echo, one of those places that wasn't officially decommissioned, but hadn't had regular patrols in years. It was mainly used for overflow now, spare units, training, or guys like me, those nearing the end of their service, waiting for discharge. There were 7 of us. We kept each other sane with jokes, cheap ramen, and old DVDs. We'd draw straws for night watch, even though there hadn't been a single threat report in years. The only thing dangerous out there was boredom. Until Private J went missing. He was the youngest, barely 19, a bit of a space cadet. One morning, his bunk was empty. Boots gone, parka gone, rifle gone, but no footprints in the snow. We radioed it in, and command told us to sweep the woods. They sent a chopper by noon. No sign. That night, I pulled the short straw and got posted at the southern end of the perimeter. Freezing cold, no wind, just that horrible dense silence that comes right before snowfall. I stood there for over an hour, listening to nothing. Then I heard boots crunching behind me. I turned around, expecting my CO, but there was nobody, and yet the snow was disturbed, like someone had walked right up to me. The pattern in the snow was strange, though. The steps were long and uneven, almost dragging. Not military issue. I called it in. They told me to come back inside and chalked it up to nerves. I couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, Jay's rifle was found leaning against the door to the supply shack, perfectly clean, not a speck of snow on it, like someone had placed it there seconds before dawn. That's when Sergeant Du told us the story. Apparently, years ago, a unit stationed at Echo had a corporal who snapped, got frostbite on patrol, started hallucinating, walked straight into enemy territory barefoot, never came back. His body was never found. Rumor was he still wandered the woods looking for his boots, looking for someone to take his place in the cold. "Every few years someone goes missing out here," Doe said, his face pale but calm. They say if you see him, don't answer. Don't speak, just stand still, or he'll think you're the one who left him behind. We laughed it off, until Private Kang disappeared too. This time we all heard it, boots in the hallway at 3 a.m, walking slow. He wasn't on duty, he wasn't dressed, just got up and left. And the next morning, there were 2 sets of tracks leading into the woods, none coming back. Do locked the doors from that night forward, shifted us all to buddy system, but even that didn't help. During my final week, I was paired with Hyun-soo. Good guy, quiet but solid. We were on perimeter check when we heard it. Someone crying, a man's voice low and broken just beyond the tree line, repeating the same thing over and over. Why'd you leave me? Hyun-soo stepped forward, flashlight aimed. Hello? He called. I yanked him back. Don't speak to it. But it was too late. The crying stopped, and then it laughed. We ran back to base. Full sprint. Reported it. No response from command. Weather had knocked out comms. That night, Hyun-soo was gone. Not a trace. Boots still under his bunk. I was the last one left. On my final morning, Sergeant Doe handed me my discharge papers. Said nothing. He looked hollow, like sleep hadn't visited him in days. As I left, I passed the supply shack, and I saw it. Boot prints, dozens of them, all different sizes, all facing the barracks, and a single parka, neatly folded, sitting in the snow. I turned back, but the base was gone. Just white. I kept walking. I never talk about Watch Post Echo when people ask about my service. I just tell them I did my time near the DMZ, learned how to shoot, learned how to endure boredom. But when it snows too quietly and the wind dies down, I still hear it. The slow, dragging steps of someone looking for warmth, and the voice that always follows, you left me. So I'm taking your place. I grew up in a small barangay at the edge of a jungle in Bukidnon, the kind of place you won't find on most maps. Dirt roads, wooden homes, a single chapel that doubled as a school during the week. People there respected 2 things, their neighbors and the forest. We had rules, not written down, but everyone knew them. You don't whistle after sunset. You don't point at the trees with your lips. And if you ever see a blue-feathered bird near the Ballet Grove, you turn around and go home. You don't talk to it. You don't follow it. You pretend it was never there. We had a local legend about the Binantayan, a spirit said to guard the forest, taking many shapes, sometimes bird, sometimes deer, sometimes human. It punished those who stole from the land or disrespected its silence. Every 7 years, our village would hold a quiet ritual. No fanfare, no public festival. Just a small procession into the jungle, an offering buried beneath a tree, and a whispered prayer asking to be left alone. The last time the ritual was held, I was 16. That year, something went wrong. It started with a boy named Nilo. He was new. His family had just moved into the village from the city. His father worked for the logging company, the kind that clears responsibly, but never really asks permission. Nilo was a city kid, full of attitude. He laughed at our beliefs, called them jungle stories for jungle minds. I didn't like him, but I didn't hate him either. He was just loud. One afternoon, a few weeks before the ritual, I saw him walking toward the Ballet Grove with a slingshot in hand. Said he was hunting birds. I told him to turn around. He smirked and asked if I was afraid of fairies. I didn't follow him. I wasn't that stupid. But I remember the sound that came from the trees after he vanished from view. It was a laugh, not a bird call. A laugh, high, sharp, and not human. Nilo came back 2 hours later, looking pale. He didn't say a word. He wouldn't answer questions. His mother dragged him home, and for days he barely spoke. His eyes always darted toward the trees. When the elders heard what had happened, they moved up the ritual. It was meant to be a quiet affair, but there was tension in the air that night. The village formed a line, each of us holding candles, walking in silence down the path into the forest. The elders carried the offering, a carved wooden box filled with rice, salt, betel leaves, and something wrapped in red cloth that none of us were allowed to look at. We buried it beneath a specific tree, always the same one. Its trunk twisted unnaturally, and the soil around it was black as ash. The priest said the prayer, the elders took turns bowing. It was supposed to be enough, But when we turned to head back, Nilo was missing. We searched for hours. We called his name even though we weren't supposed to call out in the woods at night. Nothing. No tracks, no sound. Eventually the priest said we had to go back. The forest has already answered, he said. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn we found Nilo in front of the chapel. He was standing upright, eyes open, mouth agape. Rigid as stone, his arms were at his sides, no heartbeat, no breath. They said his body hadn't fallen. He was buried standing just like we found him. No casket. The priest blessed the grave and no one spoke his name again. 3 days later, the trees near the logging site caught fire. No cause was ever found, no lightning, no dry heat, no cigarette butts. Just a wall of flame that stopped right at the border of our village, like something had drawn a line in the dirt and dared us to cross it. After that, the logging company pulled out. The elders declared a new rule: no more city families. The path to the Balate Grove was blocked off, and every year, even without the full ritual, we leave a small offering at the jungle's edge. A bowl of rice, a matchstick, and a single red cloth. I moved away years ago, but I still dream about Nilo. Still see his face in that final moment, mouth hanging open like he was about to speak, or scream, or beg for something we couldn't give him. They say the Binantayan watches from the trees, still wearing his shape, not as punishment, but as a reminder. Some forests are alive, some gods don't forgive. My mother used to tell me never to throw stones into a well. She said wells are old mouths, they remember voices, and some of them still speak back. I grew up in a small village in Kerman province, on the edge of Dashti Lut, the desert where they say nothing grows and the sun forgets to blink. My uncle, Reza, owned a pomegranate farm. My parents sent me there every summer to toughen up. No cell service, no electricity past 10, just lanterns, prayer rugs, and dust that never left your skin. The well sat at the far edge of the farm, built from old black stone and surrounded by a low rusted gate. No bucket, no rope, just a circular hole that looked too deep to ever reach the bottom. It was dry, everyone knew that, but no one ever went near it. Jinn live in forgotten places, Uncle Reza once said. They like quiet, they like depth. He meant the well. I was 17 when it happened. It started with the wind. For 3 nights the wind didn't stop. It wasn't loud, but it circled the house, pressed against the windows, slid under the doorframe, always just loud enough to make sleep light and thoughts heavy. On the 4th night I woke up around 3 a.m. The lantern had gone out. The air was too still. I sat up to relight it. That's when I heard it. A voice, far off, soft, echoing from across the orchard. It was singing, a low hum, the same note, over and over again, like a mother trying to soothe a child that wouldn't sleep. I opened the door and stepped outside. The wind was gone, the orchard was still, too still, and the singing continued. Not closer, not louder, just clearer. I followed it, past the pomegranate trees, past the irrigation ditch until I reached the gate of the well. The singing stopped. I don't know why I stepped closer. I wasn't sleepwalking. I remember everything too clearly. When I leaned over the stone edge, I saw nothing, just blackness. And then a sound, not an echo, not wind, a whisper. So quiet, I almost didn't hear it. What is your name? I didn't answer, and I didn't move, because the voice didn't come from below. It came from behind me. I turned so fast I lost my balance and scraped my hand on the stone. No one was there. But the voice came again. What is your name? I ran. Didn't stop until I was under the covers. I didn't tell Uncle Reza. I didn't sleep. The next morning my voice was hoarse, not sore, not sick, just thin, like something had scraped it from the inside. That's when things started changing. On the 2nd day, the pomegranate trees nearest the well began to rot. The fruit blackened overnight. The air smelled like copper and smoke. Uncle Reza blamed a fungus, but I saw the fear behind his eyes. On the 3rd day, I stopped hearing birds. None. Not a single crow, not a sparrow. Just silence. That night I heard the voice again, from inside the house. What is your name? I locked my door. The next morning there were footprints in the flour Uncle Reza spread by the front entrance, a farmer's trick to spot snakes, except these weren't snake tracks. They were barefoot and burned into the floorboards. That's when he finally told me. Years ago, when Reza was my age, he had a brother. Younger, curious. One night, that brother threw a stone down the well after a dare, laughed when it echoed, but something laughed back. He disappeared 2 nights later. No trace, just ash in his bed and scorch marks around the well. The village cleric said he had spoken with something that wasn't meant to speak, something that asked his name. "You don't give a jinn your name," Reza said, "not unless you want it to follow you forever." I begged him to help. He contacted a mullah from Yazd, an old man with silver rings on every finger and verses tattooed on his palms. The mullah didn't ask questions. He walked to the well before sunset. He placed a mirror facing into the opening, lit incense, drew a circle of salt, and then he whispered something I couldn't hear. The wind returned instantly, violent, howling. The orchard bent in half, the earth cracked, the mirror shattered, and from the well came a voice made of voices. "You already gave it to me." Then everything stopped, just like that. The wind, the noise, the heat. It was over. The mullah didn't speak again. Literally, he lost the ability to talk. His throat swelled shut the next day. Doctors said it was an allergic reaction, but I knew. So did Reza. I left the farm that summer. Years passed. I moved, changed numbers, changed cities, but every once in a while I'll get a call. Blocked number. Dead silence on the other end. Then a whisper. Always the same question. "What is your name?" My name's Yuto, and I used to be a stagehand for a community theatre in the Shimane prefecture, out in the countryside, where nothing ever happens unless you make it happen yourself. We performed mostly traditional plays, no and kabuki stuff for tourists, and during festival season we'd get busloads of city folks hungry for authentic culture. It paid the bills. One summer, an older actor named Sano-san returned to our group after being gone for years. He used to be a legend in our town, known for his chilling portrayal of demons in No Theatre. People said he'd get too into it, like the role stuck to him even after he left the stage. I'd never met him before, but when he showed up he looked frail, thin, like something had been eating at him for a long time. He brought his own props in a weathered black trunk. Inside, among faded scripts and stained costumes, was a Hanya mask. It was different from the ones we normally used. Most are lacquered wood, polished, painted white, with red lips and gold horns. This one was darker, rougher, carved from what looked like old driftwood, and the horns were real, small, curved animal horns that had been fused into the mask. The eyes weren't painted, they were hollow. I remember picking it up once when no one was around. It was heavier than I expected, and cold. The kind of cold that makes your fingers tingle. Sano-san insisted on using it for the festival play. The director protested, said we had better-looking masks, but Sano wouldn't budge. "This one," he said, "knows the role." We all laughed. That was a mistake. Rehearsals started to feel off. Sano wasn't just playing a demon. He was becoming one. He'd growl lines under his breath even when we were on break. One time, I caught him in the dressing room, staring at the mask and whispering something in a dialect I didn't recognize. His eyes looked glassy, like he wasn't really there. Then people started getting hurt. One actress, Keiko, slipped on stage during a run-through, broke her wrist. She swore someone had grabbed her ankle, but no one was near her. Another actor had a seizure in the middle of a scene. He said he saw Sano's eyes change, said they weren't human for a moment. The director called for a cleansing. We brought in a local Shinto priest, just a young guy really, barely older than me. He walked through the theatre, sprinkling salt, muttering prayers. When he got to the mask, he stopped cold. Wouldn't touch it, said it had Nuretaki no Ikari, the anger of wet wood. I didn't know what that meant at the time, but later I found out it referred to wood that had been soaked in death. He told us the mask was cursed, that it had absorbed too many roles, too much pain. He said it needed to be burned. Sano refused, locked it in the props room. The night of the performance came. The theatre was packed. The lights dimmed, the music started, and Sano walked on stage wearing that mask. From the first line, I knew something was wrong. He wasn't acting. His voice was deeper, almost guttural. The way he moved didn't look choreographed. It looked instinctive, like a predator circling prey. When he screamed during the third act, babies in the crowd cried. A few people even left. Then came the part where the demon is supposed to be banished. The priest character stepped forward to deliver the final chant. But Sano didn't go down. He didn't kneel, didn't cry out. He lunged. He tackled the actor playing the priest and started clawing at his face. People thought it was still part of the show until the blood hit the stage lights. Then it was chaos. The crew rushed in. I remember grabbing the mask, trying to pull it off his face. It wouldn't budge. I don't mean it was stuck. I mean it was part of him. The skin around the edges had fused. His lips moved inside the mask. His eyes blinked through the hollow sockets. It took 4 men to drag him down. When they finally pulled the mask free, he stopped breathing. We held the funeral 2 days later. The priest returned. This time he performed a full ritual, not just a cleansing. He brought sake, salt, and fire. We burned the mask in a stone pit behind the shrine, surrounded by bells and prayer ropes. But here's the part that won't leave me. As it burned, the mask laughed. Not a sound from the flames. The sound came from inside my own head, clear as day, a laugh that turned into a cry that turned into silence. I left the theatre company that year, moved to the city. I don't touch props anymore, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I see it. Not the mask. Him, Sano-san, in the dressing room, whispering to something that didn't have a name, rehearsing for a role he could never walk away from. I used to live in a small house near the Cambodian border. Nothing fancy, just a one-room structure built into the base of a hill. It was a quiet life. I raised chickens, grew herbs, and fixed generators for the neighboring farms. I was 28 at the time, and I'd been renting that place for about a year. The air was clean, and the locals kept to themselves, which suited me just fine. There was a forest that grew thick behind the hill. Most people avoided it. The older folks said the trees were cursed, that things walked through there at night that didn't belong to this world. I didn't believe in that kind of thing. Spirits, curses, I thought that was all for kids and tourists. That changed during the dry season. It started with the dogs. Every night for a week straight, the dogs in the village barked and howled non-stop. Not the usual, someone's coming bark. This was different, shrill, scared, like they were warning us or begging us to listen. People said it was just a leopard or maybe a sick cow dying in the forest, but deep down, nobody believed that. One night, I stayed up late working on a broken fuse box. I was outside, shirtless, sweating through my jeans when I saw her. There was a woman standing on the hill. At first, I thought maybe she was lost. She was barefoot, wearing a faded blue skirt, with her long black hair tied in a messy braid that hung down her front. She didn't move, just stood there, maybe 20 feet up the slope, with her hands dangling at her sides. Her posture was off, like her knees didn't bend right. I called out, asked if she needed help. She didn't answer. Then she squatted, not like how people normally squat. She sort of folded at the waist and dropped down fast, like her legs had no joints, and I swear she bent too far forward. Her head nearly touched the ground, but her arms stayed limp. That's when I knew something was wrong, deeply wrong. I backed away slowly and went inside, locked the door, shut off the lights. The next morning, I hiked up the hill out of curiosity. There were no footprints, just a foul smell, like rotting meat and stagnant water. I told the village headman, and he got quiet, asked me if she had a braid. When I said yes, he just muttered something under his breath and walked away. That should have been enough. I should have taken the hint. But I stayed. A few nights later, it got worse. I woke up to a sound, something between a slurp and a squish, like someone eating with their mouth open in the next room. Except I was alone, and I didn't have any windows open. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. Then I heard a wet dragging sound coming from my roof. Not footsteps, not claws, just dragging. I grabbed my flashlight and crept outside. The beam caught something moving, fast. I only saw it for a second, but it was enough. It was her, but she didn't have legs anymore, or a body. It was just her head. Her neck stretched into a long trail of wet, glowing entrails that twisted behind her like the tail of a jellyfish. Her eyes were rolled back and her mouth opened wide, not in a scream, but in a long, slow exhale. I dropped the flashlight. I couldn't move, my body locked up with fear. She hovered there, inches off the ground, like something half-born. Her organs swayed gently, pulsing with a soft red light, like veins lit from inside. I think I whimpered. I don't remember. All I know is I closed my eyes and didn't open them until the sound stopped. She was gone by sunrise. I packed a bag and left that same day. Later, I found out the hill used to be a burial ground. Decades ago, during the rainy season, a woman had died giving birth up there. No one buried her properly. No monks, no chants. Her spirit, according to the older villagers, never moved on. It stayed attached to the place, growing twisted over the years. They said if you see her in her human form, don't speak to her, don't offer help. That's how she finds her next skin to crawl into. I don't know if she followed me. Sometimes I still hear dogs barking at nothing in the middle of the night. But I don't look anymore. I just listen. I was 24 when I returned to my family's land in the Kangai Mountains. My grandfather had died and the herd was dying with him. My father begged me to come back, to take over. I was living in Ulaanbaatar at the time, working in a repair shop, drinking too much, chasing money that never came. Returning to the steppe felt like a step backward, but I went. Our ger stood exactly where I remembered it, facing east, tucked against the hills, where the wind couldn't cut through too hard. The land was colder than I remembered, empty. The old horses were gone, and only a few goats remained. My father didn't speak much, just pointed to the shrine near the edge of the land, a rough stack of stones with animal bones tucked beneath it. Your grandfather didn't leave them an offering before he passed, he said, staring at the mound. You'll have to make it right. I didn't know what he meant. He refused to explain. Just gave me a pouch of dried milk, a knife, and a carved wooden bowl. The night I performed the ritual, the sky was heavy with stars, no clouds, no wind. I stood by the shrine and recited the words my father had scratched onto parchment. I placed the milk into the bowl, cut a sliver from my palm and let the blood drip in. Then I whispered my grandfather's name. 3 times. I waited. Nothing happened. But that night, the bones began to move. They clinked softly against one another, even though there was no wind. I thought it was just the cold, maybe animals nearby. But when I stepped outside, I saw it with my own eyes. The bones rearranged themselves into the shape of a man crouching low, head tilted toward the ground. I didn't run. I couldn't. My legs locked in place. Then it spoke. Not with a voice, but with a feeling. A pressure in my chest, like 1,000 regrets trying to crawl their way up my throat. You took, but gave nothing back. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I told my father. He looked away, ashamed. He said when he was a boy, my grandfather had once defied a shaman's warning, took a sacred ram meant for ritual slaughter, and used it to breed stronger stock. The shaman cursed him, said his spirit would be chained to the land until someone gave the ram back. But the ram is long dead, I said. He nodded. Exactly. So now it's your blood they want. Over the next few days, things got worse. The herd refused to move. One goat gnawed its own leg off. I woke up every night to the sound of bones shifting outside. Never footsteps, never breath, just clinking. One morning, I found my father's horse collapsed at the shrine. Its eyes had been removed carefully, as if by hands. I went to the town 3 valleys over to find Abu, a local shaman. She was old, wrapped in thick layers of wool, and smelled like juniper smoke. When I told her what was happening, she didn't ask for proof. She just stared at me and said, "The bones are not angry. They are hungry. You've woken something." I begged her to help me. She agreed, but only if I brought her to the shrine before sundown. So we rode fast, cutting across the frozen grasslands, the sky bleeding into dusk. She didn't speak during the ride, just clutched a bundle wrapped in red cloth. Inside were dried herbs, a few goat knuckles, and a shard of what looked like human bone. When we reached the shrine, the wind stopped. She knelt by the bones and began to chant, low, rhythmic, words that didn't sound like Mongolian or any language I'd heard. The bones trembled, then rose, stacked, built themselves higher than any man. The creature took shape. No face, no skin, just bones threaded together by sinew I couldn't see. A mouth formed from the curve of a pelvis, fingers made from sharpened ribs. I turned to run, but the shaman grabbed my arm. "You started this," she whispered. "It needs your memory." She reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a photo of my grandfather, the only one I had. Then she threw it into the shrine fire she'd started. The flames exploded upward, and the creature let out a sound I'll never forget. Not a scream, a gasp, like the wind choking on something it shouldn't have breathed in. And then it collapsed, bones falling flat, like someone had cut invisible strings. The shaman didn't speak on the ride back. She died 3 weeks later. No known cause. My father passed not long after. I buried him far from the shrine. Now I live alone in that gur. The goats are healthy again. The wind moves like it used to. But I keep the bowl and the knife. Because every 7 days, just after sundown, I leave a strip of meat by the stones, and the bones never move, but they're still listening. I was 26 when I took a job documenting riverfront cremation rituals in Varanasi for a foreign NGO. They wanted footage, photos, cultural exposure. I took it because the pay was good and I'd always wanted to see the Ganges. What I didn't realize was how close I'd be. The main ghat was packed, priests chanting, bodies wrapped in white cloth, fires burning like stars fallen to earth. The smell was unforgettable. Not foul exactly, just final. The kind of scent that reminds you everything ends. I stayed in a small guest house a few 100 meters up the river. The owner was a quiet man named Pairav. He asked me not to film at night, said the river changed after sundown. His tone was serious, not superstitious. Naturally, I ignored him. One night, just past midnight, I took my camera down to the river alone. I'd heard stories of secret cremations, the poor, the untouchables, those the families couldn't afford to burn by day. I figured I might get something raw, real. The ghat was empty, no priests, no mourners, just a faint mist rising from the water and the last embers of a fire still glowing orange. That's when I saw the boy. He sat at the edge of the pyre, completely still, staring into the dying flames. At first I thought he was a mourner, but then I saw his back, burned, charred, as if he'd sat too close to the fire for too long, and then he turned. There was no face, just ash. His head was the grey-white texture of burnt wood, with holes where the eyes should be. No mouth, no hair, just the faintest suggestion of a human head, half consumed and still watching. I ran, didn't stop until I reached my room, locked the door, didn't tell anyone. But the next morning something was left at the door of the guest house. A handful of bone fragments wrapped in a damp cloth, my name written on it in red powder. I confronted Pairav. He didn't look surprised. He told me about the pretas, spirits of those cremated without rites, or those whose ashes were never scattered properly. He said some souls never leave the earth, not because they want to stay, but because they weren't shown how to go. He asked me a strange question. Did you step over the ash line? I didn't know what he meant. Apparently, at the burning ghat, there's a faint chalk line that circles each active pyre, a boundary meant to contain spiritual residue. If you cross it, you're carrying something back. You have to return it, he said, before it gets hungry. That night, I had a dream. The boy was at the edge of my bed, this time closer. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. He leaned forward, not with anger, not with speed, just slow, inevitable presence, and I heard a voice inside my head. Not yours, mine. Return it. The next day, Pairav led me to a smaller private ghat downriver, a place used only when something needed to be quiet. We placed the bones in a small pot. He poured ghee and river water over them, chanted something I couldn't understand. Then he told me to carry the pot down to the edge, kneel, and let it go. As I lowered it into the water, I felt the pot twitch in my hands, like something inside didn't want to leave, but I let it sink. Pairav said nothing for a long time, just stared at the ripples. You'll be fine, he finally said, unless you dream of fire again. If that happens, don't wake up. It's been 4 years, no dreams, no whispers. I've never gone back to India, but I keep that last line with me. Because some nights when the air is too quiet and I see smoke from a distant chimney, I wonder, if I had woken up in that dream, what would I have seen? My older brother, Lakpa, died in the winter of 2018. He slipped during a solo climb near the Manaslu base camp, found a week later, frozen solid, his face turned toward the sky like he was waiting for someone. We lived in Kathmandu, but our mother was born in the mountains, and she insisted on taking his body back to her ancestral village for a proper farewell. Not cremation, she said. He always feared the fire. I was 22, angry, tired, grieving. I told her it didn't matter. He was already gone, but she insisted we follow the old way. So we traveled north toward Gorka, where the peaks gnaw at the clouds and the silence in the air feels older than language. A sky burial was arranged. The monks built the altar, chanted the prayers, and laid my brother's body out beneath a field of prayer flags. I stayed in the guest shelter. I didn't watch. It felt barbaric. When it was over, my mother scattered a small handful of ashes into the wind. What little remained. She said it would guide his soul through the clouds. I said nothing, just wanted to go home. I should have stayed. 2 weeks after the ritual, I started hearing the wind speak. It sounds stupid when I say it like that, but it wasn't just wind. It formed something. Not a word exactly, but a presence. Every night around 3 a.m., a cold draft would pass through my apartment window. Even if it was closed, it always smelled like pine smoke and burnt wool. At first, I thought it was just in my head, some grief-triggered sensory thing, but then I started to hear something else. My name, whispered, low, repeating, like someone calling for help but not sure how loud they should be. It happened 3 nights in a row, then it stopped. I thought I was finally free of it, and then came the knock. 3 soft taps on the window pane. I live on the 3rd floor. I didn't look. I told myself it was the building shifting, or maybe a bird, but the next morning I found a single feather on my pillow, black, frozen stiff, and a smudge of ash on the windowsill. I called my mother. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked me a question I didn't expect. You didn't say goodbye, did you? I didn't know what she meant. She told me that during sky burials, every living relative must touch the body before it's taken, not for tradition, but to give the dead permission to go. If someone refuses, the soul stays near them, confused, waiting. You kept him here, she said, and now he doesn't understand why. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was scared, because I felt guilty, deep, crushing guilt, and I wasn't alone. Around 2:50 a.m., the temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath turned white. I heard a scraping sound, like boots dragging over stone. I sat on my bed, still, heart racing. Then I heard the knock again, 3 times, slow. I turned to face the window, and this time I looked. He was standing just outside the glass. Lakpa, eyes hollow, skin tight and pale. He wasn't decayed, he just looked cold, sad, like something carved from ice and forgotten. He didn't speak, just lifted one hand and pressed it to the glass. I wanted to open it. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't move. Then, in the silence, I heard a faint voice, inside my head, or inside the room. I don't know. Why didn't you let me go? I shut my eyes, and when I opened them, he was gone. The next day, I bought a bus ticket back to Gorka. It took 2 days to reach the same field. The monks were surprised but didn't ask questions. I brought with me a small red cloth bag that held one thing. My brother's climbing gloves, the ones he wore every summit. I'd stolen them from his things before the ritual, held onto them like a souvenir. I gave them to the wind that day. The monks chanted. I touched the platform, said his name, then said goodbye. The wind shifted. For the first time in weeks, it felt warm. I haven't seen him since, but sometimes on high bridges or in narrow alleys, when the wind hits just right and it smells faintly of smoke, I pause and I say goodbye again, just in case he forgot. I spent 9 months at a monastery in the Nyenchen Tangala Mountains, not as a monk. I was a cultural anthropology student from the UK, granted special permission to observe a traditional dark retreat. The monks called it Nangompa, meditation in complete silence and darkness. No light, no speech, no outside interaction. The retreat cell was carved into the rock of a cliff, far from the main prayer halls. Monks would enter these rooms for 49 days, emerging only if something had gone spiritually wrong. Most never spoke of what they saw in the dark. My guide was an older monk named Tenzin, calm and grounded. He had been in retreat 3 times and bore the stillness of someone who no longer worried about time. The monastery overlooked a sky burial platform, a raised slab of stone where bodies were ritually offered to vultures. It wasn't hidden or fenced. The locals didn't fear it. It was sacred, but Tenzin once told me never to visit it after dusk. He said the wind there was not just wind, that it carried whispers, souls still navigating the Badon, who had not yet found a door back into the cycle. Sometimes they speak, he said. Sometimes they listen. The danger is not hearing them. The danger is answering. I didn't believe him. I thought it was metaphor. That changed on the 33rd day of the retreat. I had been helping transport food to the outer chambers. We were never allowed to speak to the monks in meditation. We left the bowls outside the cells, bowed, and walked away. That evening, fog rolled in unusually fast. The air felt dense. The sky burial platform, just barely visible from the monastery, seemed to glow slightly in the mist, though there was no moon. And then, a voice, not loud, not booming, but clear. A whisper carried directly into my ear, even though I was alone in the stone corridor. You heard me. Please don't leave. I dropped the offering bowl. I told Tenzin. He looked disturbed for the first time since I'd met him. He asked me where I'd heard it. I pointed toward the corridor leading to the retreat cell of a young monk named Gorka, one of the few I'd spoken to before he began his silence. Tenzin went still. Gorka's retreat ended 3 days ago, he said quietly. He never emerged. I didn't understand. I had delivered food to that door every day. He never took it, Tenzin added. We left the bowls, but they were always full in the morning. The next day, the elders forced open the retreat cell. Gorka was gone. No blood, no sign of departure, just a strange pile of prayer flags, windhorse flags, tied together and knotted into a rope, stretching from one corner of the cell to the window slit, carved into the cliff, and burned handprints on the stone wall behind where he would have been seated. The elder monks declared the retreat disturbed. I was told to leave the monastery immediately. I begged Tenzin to tell me what they thought had happened. He only said one thing. Gorka must have spoken. The Badon isn't a place, it's a listening. I returned to Lhasa the next morning. A week later, I received a package from the monastery. No letter, just a bundle of fabric, Gorka's meditation robe, and inside one of its folds, a strip of knotted prayer flag, with a single line written in ink so faded I nearly missed it. They said I could come back, but they never said as who. I don't sleep well anymore. The wind still carries words sometimes, and I never answer, not out loud. 10 stories, 10 warnings, from rivers that remember to forests that don't forgive, from voices behind you to footsteps that never leave. These weren't just tales from faraway lands. These were accounts of people who saw too much, spoke too soon, or simply listened when they shouldn't have. Folklore survives for a reason. It teaches us where not to look, when not to speak, and sometimes what it means when the silence finally breaks. If you made it this far, thank you for walking through the dark with us. I've been Mason, and this is ChaTV. Be sure to subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications, so the next time something stirs in the shadows, you'll be ready to hear the story. Until then, keep your windows closed, keep your name to yourself, and whatever you do, don't answer the voice in the wind.